Hey guys, welcome back to another Genshin Impact character guide. Today we're going to talk about Venti, one of the best support characters in the game. He has amazing crowd control capabilities and damage output, and fits in most team comps. He'll make your life easier in artifact domains and the Spiral Abyss. We'll go over how to play Venti with optimization and setups, his best weapons, artifacts, and his constellations. Before we begin, please keep in mind that these guides do take a bit of time, so if you liked the video, please make sure to like and subscribe, as only 99% of my viewers are subscribers. So yeah, let's get started. First, let's talk about his elemental skill. Venti will send out a gust of wind in front of him that can launch smaller enemies. It has a very short cooldown of 6 seconds, has a good amount of range, and it can easily hit enemies from a distance. Paired with the 4-piece Viridescent set, you can use it to lower enemies' elemental resistance to a particular element. His elemental skill animation can take long, so make sure you animation cancel them by dashing, switching out characters with one normal attack cancel, jumping, attacking, and most importantly, his elemental burst, which we need to talk about in depth next. Using an elemental skill followed by an elemental burst is called an E to Q cancel, E and Q being keyboard keys, and there are two main reasons why you want to do this. The first reason is that you want to generate elemental particles first and then empty your elemental burst gauge so that you can refill it right back faster. It takes time for these elemental particles shown here to reach your character, so while you are in your burst animation, you can use that time to gain back energy. You'll have more energy before casting your next burst. The second reason is that a character generates the most energy when they are receiving elemental particles on the field instead of off the field. So since Venti usually switches out after he casts his burst, it's better to cast his elemental skill first to receive those particles on the field. So here's my team using the E to Q cancel. They're all gaining elemental particles with their elemental skills before using their elemental bursts for optimal energy recharging. Doing the domain like this allows me to have all my party members' elemental bursts back up at the end from one Venti burst. Next, when you hold your elemental skill, Venti will cast a wind current for bigger AoE damage that sends Venti upwards. You can do a plunge attack right after to come down faster and use your glider again to go back up again. The up current that gets created at the end lasts for 20 seconds and is unlocked when you get Venti's first passive talent. It's mainly used for fun and exploration and not for combat with its long cooldown and you spend too much time in the air. You can use it for things like climbing, reaching Oculus or gate items, and dodging enemies' attacks. And remember that it's Genshin Impact's original co-op party trick. Now let's talk about Venti's elemental burst. Venti will shoot an arrow that creates a wind vortex that will gather smaller enemies. It lasts for 8 seconds with a 15-second cooldown and has an energy cost of 60. It has medium-sized range and will auto-aim if there is a nearby enemy. The auto-aim can mess up your elemental burst placing, and it's ideal to gather the most enemies as you can. So here's an example. There are two Electro Mages on the opposite sides. I try to aim my burst in the center to gather both, but the auto-aim makes me shoot towards the mage behind me. The other mage is now too far away and out of range to get inside Venti's burst. Now if I reposition Venti further away, I can gather both of them like this. Optimal burst placing is important so that you can gather the most enemies possible, and in this case I had to override auto-aim to do so. Another reason to practice optimal burst placing is for the Spiral Abyss. If you place your burst well and can kill the first wave of monsters fast enough, you can suck in the next wave of monsters right away. Here's an example of the infamous Floor 11 Chamber 2. I want to place my burst specifically in this spot so that I can gather the most enemies possible. I can kill the enemies fast enough so that it sucks in the new waves of archers. You can see in a matter of seconds, I was able to clear 14 out of the 18 monsters with just Ganyu and Venti. Now let's talk about Elemental Infusion. When Venti's burst comes in contact with an element, there are a few things that will happen. The most notable aspect is that it will change colors to that element. Here you can see Hydro turn the vortex blue. If there was no Elemental Infusion, you can apply an element during his burst, but it is ideal you apply Infusion before the burst for more DPS. Also note you can't change the element once it's infused. Sometimes other factors will infuse an element into Venti's burst, like a shield on fire or the ice shields you see on floor 9 of the Spiral Abyss. Slimes will also infuse their own element as shown here. When Venti's burst is infused with Hydro, Pyro, Cryo, or Electro, it will deal additional elemental damage. This is called infused damage, and it is ideal to infuse an element in its burst to gain this additional damage. At level 8, you can see that the additional elemental damage is 30.1%. This damage can crit, and it's also affected by crit rate, crit damage, and attack. We can actually see all the numbers here. Another reason to infuse an element into Venti's burst is because of his second passive talent. If an element is infused, 15 energy is refunded to any characters of that infused element. Keep in mind though that Venti will be refunded 15 energy after his burst regardless of any elemental infusion. As you can see here, my Venti and Xingqiu have 0 energy. The infused element is Hydro, so both my characters will get refunded 15 energy after their burst is over. This is great for someone like Xingqiu since his burst energy cost is really high at 80. The last reason you want elemental infusion is for constant elemental application. Venti's burst actually continuously applies the element it's infused with so that you can take advantage of elemental reactions. For example, here I infused Pyro into Venti's burst so that my Ganyu can take advantage of melt reactions with her burst and her charge attacks. Here I infused the Cryo element so that my Diluc can use melt reactions over and over again. Feel free to use this technique on larger enemies as well. Although Venti's burst won't gather them together, you can always use it to continuously apply an element. Here, my Diluc can consistently use Vaporize thanks to Venti. You can also combine Elemental Infusion and Swirls to break down Abyss Mage's shields. The Swirl reaction is already good at this, but by also infusing an element, you can continuously break down their shields. Now let's talk about a common technique Venti uses called Snapshotting. To snapshot is when any buffs or stat changes are applied throughout the entire duration of a character's skill. For Venti, it will be his elemental burst. So for example, if I use Venti's burst within Bennett's burst, I don't need to stand inside the circle the entire time because the buffs have already snapshotted and the damage won't change. The same thing happens when you use the new bow, the Windbloom Ode. Once you activate its attack percent buff with your elemental skill, the buff lasts throughout Venti's burst, not just for 6 seconds as the passive says. Since Bennett is used frequently for snapshotting, it's good to learn how to set up properly with Bennett, Venti, and your DPS units. First you do an E to Q cancel with Bennett, but you have to do this quickly or you won't get the energy back. Then you switch to Venti, and then you want to dash back, and then do an E to Q cancel. The elemental skill will auto aim when you do it like this. When you set up like this, Venti's burst should be just around the edge of Bennett's circle, so your DPS can comfortably stay inside the circle and use Bennett's attack buff. Thing to consider with Venti's burst is knowing who can hit the enemies inside of it comfortably. It's known that it can be hard to hit enemies since they move up and down rapidly. The Venti Discord made a list of who can hit inside of Venti's burst. It's important to know since it can affect your team building. The link to the list is in the description below. It's also good to experiment yourself and find ways around this. Now for a very important question. What level do you keep Venti? First, at the bare minimum, he should be level 60 out of 70 ascended to unlock his second passive talent. Now from here, you need to understand what happens when you level up Venti further. First, Venti will do more swirl damage because it's calculated from your level and elemental mastery. But the most important thing is this, we just mentioned that it can be difficult to hit enemies inside Venti's burst. However, if Venti has a 21 level difference than an enemy, he actually cannot lift the enemies up from his burst. Instead, they will only gather together and it will make it much easier for you to hit enemies. This definitely can be something to consider and an option I wanted to bring to your attention. Keep in mind that some enemies can teleport out of Venti's burst if you do decide to go this route. In my opinion, I think it's completely worth it to get Venti to at least level 80 or 80 out of 90 ascended for the extra energy recharge. This way his burst can lift up enemies, assuming an enemy's max level is 100, and do a good amount of damage. If you have the resources, feel free to level him to 90 as well. Now for talent prioritization. You want to level up his elemental burst first and then his elemental skill. If you're using Venti just for support, I recommend not leveling his auto attacks, but if you want to use him for DPS and for fun, feel free to level his auto attacks if you like. Now let's look at the weapons for Venti. Everything in this tier list is at Refinement 1, and I'll be making 2 tier lists, one for damage and one for support. These tier lists are ordered based on each weapon's damage output, usability, and subjective claims. I will link more resources that explain refinements in detail in the description below. For raw damage and amazing stats, Skyward Harp is the best in slot. Its crit rate secondary stat and crit damage from its passive helps you build Venti a lot easier as well. Not to mention the physical AoE damage passive adds on some damage which can be procced from Venti's skills. Amos Bow is considered here because of its high base attack as a 5-star weapon and its attack percent secondary substat. You will rarely use its passive as support Venti. However, it will lose out to Alley Hunter with only a few refinements and to R5 Stringless. The Alley Hunter is a weapon that will be coming very soon at the time of the release of this video. It has high base damage for a 4-star weapon, as the Alley series usually does, and its secondary stat is attack percent. Its passive will increase your overall damage, and at max stacks and a few refinements, it will even outdamage the Amos bow. The Stringless is a classic and very popular weapon for Venti. Its secondary stat of Elemental Mastery will increase swirl damage, and its passive will increase the damage of your Elemental Skill and Elemental Burst. It's always a safe choice for a support Venti, so if you don't have any of the 5-star bows, feel free to invest in it, since it especially benefits from refinements and can potentially outdamage the Amos bow. The Viridescent Hunt is also a decent weapon on Venti. Its secondary stat of crit rate will help you build Venti a lot easier, and he benefits from it a lot since there are many instances of damage on his burst. Technically, this does outdamage the Stringless slightly, but I don't recommend going out of your way to get this bow if you already have a Stringless. When using this bow, try the E to normal attack 1 to Q cancel that was mentioned in the beginning of this video to get a 50% chance to proc its Cyclone for extra AoE damage. Now for the new patch 1.4 event bow, the Windbloom Ode. This is a great free weapon, and it doesn't fall too behind on R1 Stringless. You need to use your elemental skill to proc its passive for a 32% attack buff at R5. Not everyone has a Stringless, so this would be a good replacement for it. If you don't compare this with the Festering Desire, the free event sword we received before, you'll see that it is a decent weapon on Venti. Now for the support weapons tier list. I am not a huge fan of having energy recharge on weapons for Venti, since you can gain energy recharge from his artifacts, but if you feel like you don't have 100% uptime on his elemental burst, feel free to use some of these weapons. The new bow Elegy for the End is Venti's best support weapon. Its passive increases your elemental mastery by 60. And when activating its passive, Venti can give all party members a 100 elemental mastery and 20% attack buff. This in a way mimics the role of Sucrose with a Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayer, in which he transfers a portion of her elemental mastery and an attack buff. There are two clear downsides to this bow though. Venti himself cannot receive the passive buff for his initial elemental burst because the passive takes time to activate after his burst snapshots. Also, you'll notice a considerable damage loss from this bow, which is unfortunate. The Sacrificial Bow comes in second here. Its passive gives a chance to end your elemental skill cooldown to cast it again, which explains the low energy recharge since you can get extra elemental particles. This can help with another spike of damage, but if the passive does not proc, you will fall behind in damage and get less energy, so it is highly recommended to use it at higher refinements. It can even outdamage the Windbloom Ode. The Favonius Warbow is an energy efficient bow. It has high energy recharge and its passive allows you to gain 6 energy if procced. However, the base attack is extremely low and in my opinion not a great bow for Venti since he can already sustain himself with energy recharge. If you really have nothing else, feel free to use this weapon. For early mid-game artifacts, I recommend first starting with a 2-piece Berserker set. Venti's burst has many instances of damage, so having crit rate early on will give him a bit of a damage boost. From here you have a few options. You can go for a 2-piece Exile or a 2-piece Scholar set for more uptime on your elemental burst, which I recommend. You can also use any 2-piece artifact set with an 18% attack bonus to maximize his damage, such as Sojourners, Braveheart, or Gladiators. Finally, you can go with a 2-piece Instructor set for the Elemental Mastery boost, which increases your swirl damage, which can add up early game. Or if you like, you can go with a 4-piece Instructor to better support your teammates. For late game Venti artifacts, I highly recommend the 4-piece Viridescent set. It gives you a 15% animal damage bonus, increases swirl damage by 60%, which is huge for his burst, and most importantly, it decreases the elemental resistance of the infused element in a swirl reaction by 40%. This is a huge damage boost for your entire party. The only other artifact set I can recommend is a 2-piece Viridescent and 2-piece Noblesse set to maximize his burst damage. This can work for certain team comps where you use more elemental infusion for elemental reactions instead of elemental reduction, such as a Ganyu Melt team. I still highly recommend the 4-piece Viridescent set over this though. Now for main stats. Many people get confused if attack percent, elemental mastery, or energy recharge is the best for Venti on his timepiece. I highly recommend attack percent to maximize his damage and focus on elemental mastery and energy recharge for his substats. If you feel like you need the energy recharge for his elemental burst uptime, feel free to use an energy recharge timepiece. For the goblet, you want it to have animal damage bonus. And for the headpiece, go for crit rate or crit damage, whichever you need more. I'm sure you heard this before, but go for the 1 to 2 crit rate to crit damage ratio. For the substats, focus on crit rate, crit damage, and attack percent. Then energy recharge and elemental mastery. If you're just starting with artifact farming, try to strive for at least 40% crit rate and about 100 to 120% crit damage and work your way up. For late game, I recommend hitting a crit rate of 50% and higher and crit damage at 120% and higher. For energy recharge, I recommend hitting at least 150% for Venti. Now for Venti's Constellations. Constellation 1 gives you 2 more arrows per aim shot, which isn't the best. I wouldn't actively try to go for just this one constellation over the others. Constellation 2 will decrease animal and physical resistance by 12% for 10 seconds when hitting enemies with your elemental skill, and you get an additional 12% of each if the enemy becomes airborne from it. This makes Venti a much better support for physical damage dealers like DPS Fischl or animal DPS units like Zhao, a pretty good constellation in my opinion. Constellation 3 will increase your elemental burst level by 3. Constellation 4 gives Venti a 25% animal damage bonus for 10 seconds when he receives an elemental orb or particle. This is actually a great constellation with a pretty decent damage boost combined with Constellation 2. Constellation 5 will increase your elemental skill level by 3. Constellation 6 will reduce enemies' animal resistance and any infused elements resistance by 20%. This is another great constellation because not many things in this game will reduce animal resistance, so this would be great paired with someone like Zhao. This is also great paired with the 4-piece Viridescent set to reduce enemies' elemental resistance even further. Thank you very much for watching my video. I know it was very long, but I try my best to be thorough with a character's information as much as possible. If you liked the video, please make sure to like and subscribe. Also, follow me on Twitch at twitch.tv/FrenchTutor_. I'll be streaming almost every day if I'm not making videos. Take care now. Bye.